All right, there it is. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on wood utilization, where we will be covering what happens to the tree after harvest. My name is Casey Willis, and I am the Maine Tree Farm Program Coordinator. You're talking to me likely if you're interested in a program that recognizes landowners for great stewardship, and if you're interested in being a part of a program that celebrates that stewardship and provides education resources on how to continue doing great stewardship. Um, yeah, so if you are interested in more information on that, feel free to check out our website, www.mainetreefarm.org. And that's all I'm going to say on it because you're not here to listen to me talk. You're here to listen to our amazing presenter, Cody Lachance. He works for Sappi North America and is also the Maine Tree Farm Program Somerset County Chair. And so he's going to be talking about what happens to a tree after harvest. So, Cody, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Casey. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about timber utilization and ultimately what happens to a tree after the harvest. Quick little introduction about me. I am the wood sales manager for Sappi North America. So my role is to work with our foresters and to be able to sell all of the external market wood that they harvest on their woodlot operations that they harvest throughout the state of Maine, into New Hampshire, and sometimes into Vermont. So working with foresters and wood buyers at various sawmills and log yards, making sure that all of the timber that is being cut is going to the right market and all of that. And like Casey said, we'll go over realistically what happens to a tree once it's cut and where it goes and how that process that looks like. Let me make sure I can do this. So a little overview of what we're going to cover today. We'll start with a quick timber harvesting overview just to describe how it typically works. We won't spend much time there. And we'll quickly jump into wood assessment, what goes into looking at a stem, what goes into looking at a log, trying to figure out what the best market, what the best home is for that piece of timber. We'll also dive into wood product classes. We'll look at different markets, how it all fits into the grand scheme of things, and which piece of wood is best fit for which market. And we'll talk about the product anatomy of a tree. We'll look at a little case study I've worked up, looking at an individual tree and dissecting what markets each part of the tree would go in and the financial value of that. And we'll talk about some quick takeaways I have for the group. And then the floor will be open for questions. So a quick timber harvesting overview. Realistically, this process all starts with a forest landowner like yourself. And that landowner obviously owns timberland. They're going to have objectives for their woodlot. They're going to want to manage for forest health, for wildlife habitat, for timber revenue. There's really an unlimited list, but ultimately this landowner will have some sort of objective they would like to achieve for their woodlot, hence why they have a desire to harvest timber. That's obviously a key part of this, is this landowner would like to perform a timber harvest. And on this other side, you're going to have a logging contractor that owns harvesting equipment, has trucking capacity to move that fiber once it's cut, have a dedicated staff of skilled operators that can move and operate the machinery associated with the contractor. And in the middle, that's where the forester comes in. It acts as a mediary between these two entities that brings management recommendations. They do harvest layout. They do the paperwork necessary to perform the timber harvest. They administer the timber harvest, making sure the objectives are being met that the landowner has. And really what we'll focus on today is the marketing and utilization. It's a key feature of any successful timber harvest. Is so much goes into this process for both the landowner and the logger and the forester as well, where the landowner has held this timber, they've grown this wood, the logging contractor has all of this massive equipment with skilled operators, and really the key is to make sure that all of the wood is being utilized to its highest market value, to make sure it's worthwhile for everybody to do this big step in the life cycle of a forest. Obviously, timber management, harvesting really is not something you do every year per se on the average woodlot. So when you do it, you want to make sure you do it right. So we'll talk wood assessment here. What we're talking about here is looking at a tree, looking at a log, trying to understand, okay, we have this tree, now what? Where does it go? How are we utilizing it? All of that. And really the first step is, what species is it? And the first assessment is something as simple as hardwood versus softwood. There are some markets where it's just a basic hardwood or a softwood specification. So obviously hardwood trees generally has leaves. Softwood tree generally has needles. In some markets, it's as simple as that, splitting up wood based on a general category of hardwood versus softwood. But more realistically, it's a species-specific categorization when you talk about species. So looking at hard maple versus soft maple versus yellow birch in terms of the realm of hardwood. It's not just hardwood log per se. In some markets, it's actually, there's different prices and different specifications for how to prepare that timber based on what species it is. The next part we'll look at is size. Generally speaking, there are two key metrics when it comes to looking at a piece of wood based on markets. It's top diameter, and that top diameter would be the individual log, the smaller end of that log, what that diameter is. Trees have a natural taper, so obviously the butt of the tree is going to have a larger diameter than the top of the tree. So all wood that is stick scaled is scaled at the top end or the smaller end. And there are restrictions based on product classes. We'll get into those a little bit later, but typically when you see a specification sheet come from a mill, they'll have a top diameter spec, whether that's 8 inches, whether that's 10 inches, 12 inches, and so on. And the other one is length. Generally speaking, there are some general measurements for length. Hardwood logs typically 8 foot, 10 foot, 12 foot, 14 foot, sometimes 16 foot, and so on. So when you're looking at a size of a log, trying to figure out which market it needs to go into, top diameter and length are really your two key metrics that you want to pay attention to. One that's definitely more subjective than objective is quality. And this is really where the art of scaling and the art of merchandising and utilizing wood comes into play. The first thing I'll talk about are clear faces. And what this is referring to would be the number of clear sides on an individual log. So if you're looking at the end of a log, it's a circle, almost similar to a clock. Each face is 1/4 of that log. So for instance, if a log needed to have 4 clear faces all the way around that log, there would be no defects, no bumps. It would be smooth bark all the way down that log. If there were a market that said you only need 3 clear faces, you could have 1/4 of that log, one of those faces of the 4 faces, having some sort of defect. So in my clock analogy, it would be something between the 12 hand and the 3. If there was a small bump on that 1/4 of the log, that would still technically qualify as a 3 clear face log because the other 75% or other 3 faces of that log would be clear. Another thing is sweep. That is just how straight a log is. A lot of mills will allow some sweep, whether it's 1 inch, 2 inches. And how you measure that is just as simply as take a basic tape measure. And when you're measuring your length of the log, you just have one end on one end of the log and you take that tape measure and put it down to the other end of the log. And that tape measure itself is going to be a nice straight line. And you can look down that tape measure and see if that log has any sort of bend or any sort of sweep. And if you're really fancy, you could either have somebody else there or leave that tape measure there, take another tape measure and measure the biggest distance between the tape measure and the log to figure out how much sweep you have. Typically, a mill will allow maybe 1 to 2 inches of sweep. Again, trees aren't perfect, obviously. That's why there's an art to doing this. But understanding how much sweep is allowable is very important when it comes to looking at a piece of wood and understanding which market it's best fit for. And defect. Defect, you can have scars, you can have seams, you can have burls, anything on that tree that just really brings down the quality of that tree. Because when they run that wood through a sawmill, if you have a scar on that, that's obviously going to take the amount of lumber you could saw out of that piece of wood out of the equation, because that's no good. And those defects really come into play on the clear faces, where if you have a defect on one face of that log, really not that big of a deal. If you have defects on all four faces of that log, that vastly starts to change the equation on where that log is best fit for. And rot, pretty basic. When you're looking down at the end of the log, is there any sort of rotting happening within the tree itself? Some mills will allow a certain allowance on how much rot they can allow, whether it's the size of a quarter, whether it's 2 inches, 3 inches. It all depends on where your markets are, what your markets are, and what their spec sheet looks like. So understanding those key factors is very important to making sure that you're sending the wood to where it needs to go and where you as the landowner are going to get the most bang for your buck. And I do want to bring up one more key point here. We'll get into this later when we talk about more specific products, where those typically end up in the state of Maine. But there is a difference between theoretical highest value and highest market potential. The market changes. It's quite variable. There are times where historically lower grade products might pay more than a traditional mid-grade product. And that's why it's so key to have open communication with your forester, work with them, make sure that they understand the markets. They are representing you as the landowner. And it's key amongst a variety of issues to have a good relationship with your forester, but the marketing is so important to make sure that when you are ready for a harvest, because of how important this step is in the management of your woodlot, you are making sure you are maximizing your return based on what the current market situation is. So all of what I just covered, it sounds like a lot. I'm fully aware of that. But realistically, I can't simplify it. I think everyone can agree this pile of wood does not equal this pile of wood. It does. There is a certain straight face test to all of this, where even a landowner that may not understand the markets that well, when you're on your job, when you're looking at the wood piles, you're generally going to be able to look and see and understand, well, why is this piece over here and this piece is over here? So that's one key thing to be able to look at and understand. So now we'll get into wood product classes. Today's presentation, I've really simplified it. There is some nuance to this, but realistically, I'm going to talk about 3 general forest product classes when it comes to timber: saw logs, pulpwood, and fuel wood. And over the next few slides, we'll talk about each different product class, some examples of them, and ultimately what mills typically buy those and what it ends up as the final product that we all use in our everyday lives. So we'll start with saw logs, and it's really as simple as this is timber suitable to be sawn into lumber. So whether it's houses, sheds, garages, your back patio deck, all of that, this is all wood that they are sawing this wood and it's going into some sort of building material typically, or some other commodity that we are using in our day-to-day lives. And of those 3 product classes, this is your highest value wood class. So it's pivotal that you're making sure that you are harvesting and utilizing your saw logs to their highest market value when you're cutting those trees down that have saw logs, because of the fact that they are most valuable. They're generally your larger stems. Saw logs have the largest top diameter minimums, I'll call it. So these are your bigger trees typically. And they are higher quality because, again, they're sawing out boards from these. The mills themselves want to maximize how much lumber they can get out of each piece of wood. And typically these don't have much defect on them. They're pretty high quality pieces of wood. So some saw log types that we'll go into over the next few slides. There's veneer. grade saw logs, bolt wood, and then mat and pallet logs. So we'll start with veneer. This is going to be your highest class of saw log. Whenever you're thinking, I might have some veneer stems out here, that typically does mean more money on average than any other product class. Again, the market is variable. It can change, but more times than not, if a forester says you have some veneer out here, that is the highest class of saw log that there is. These are typically hardwood species. There might be some softwoods that different foresters might anecdotally call as a softwood veneer, but in the state of Maine, when veneer is being said, it's typically of the hardwood variety. And this is our near perfect log, so not much sweep. Generally, that's 4 clear faces. Sometimes it's 3 clear faces. It's a large top diameter. This is your butt log. This is the log that you can touch when you're walking around your woodlot. You're walking around this tree. There's no limbs. There's no scars. There's no defect. Again, this is the clip art tree where there's no defect in the first 16 feet of that log. Again, straight, smooth, no defects. And for hardwood, there's typically 2 types of veneer, slicer versus rotary. And I've got a picture on screen that shows the difference. Slicer is they run saws and they just slice pieces right off that log. Very thin pieces. And then rotary, they actually put it on a spindle and they peel that wood almost like a sheet of paper. So those are your 2 types of veneer processes typically of how they extract that wood for whatever end user they're making it for. Another one that you might see in veneer is figured wood. Bird's eye maple and curly maple are 2 of the more popular ones. These variants are actually, it's technically a defect in the grain, but obviously it's well sought after in the market. And a lot of furniture makers like this. You might see a curly maple dining room table or a bird's eye pepper mill, those types of things. Some smaller woodworkers obviously fawn over this. So some things to note of when you're on your woodlot, if a forester mentions, ooh, there's some bird's eye maple here. Ooh, there might be some curly maple here. Again, as the landowner, your antenna should go up and you might want to be asking, well, do you have a bird's eye market? Do you have a curly market? And understanding what that looks like. So some products that the end user will use in terms of veneer, plywood. Columbia Forest Products is right here in the state of Maine, up in Presque Isle, and typically you can go right to Home Depot and you can find pieces of plywood with Columbia veneer on it. So pretty neat that made right in Maine is also sold right here in Maine. Vehicle interior accents. So if you have a wood dash on your car, wood accents near where you open the door to get out of the car, those types of things, you might find some hardwood veneer on that. And like I mentioned, furniture is another big one when it comes to especially the bird's eye and the curly, as well as some decorative pieces. So again, veneer, your highest quality, your biggest stem, largest market potential there. Now we'll dive into grade saw logs. And really, this is the widest range of saw logs. They come in both hardwood and softwood. And typically these are for building materials. So again, when you're building a house, building a garage, building your deck, those types of things, this is generally the area you're going to be playing in when it comes to picking out that material. So some of the products that you might see your grade saw logs be turned into at the mill. We'll start off with hardwood flooring. Kennebec Lumber, right in Solon, Maine, is also known on the end user market as Maine Traditions Flooring. They offer a wide variety of hardwood flooring for builders and homeowners and all of that. Really nice, high quality stuff. Another one is just dimensional spruce fir lumber. So obviously, if you have a spruce fir stand where they're cutting spruce fir logs, a lot of that is going to end up at a spruce fir mill to be turned into 2x4s, 2x6s, 2x8s, your framing lumber. That's what you can think of typically with your spruce fir logs. And we have Pleasant River in Dover and in Enfield, as well as Stratton Lumber over in Stratton, Maine, that both take a pretty similar product and make that framing lumber with. And another one is your pine interior boards. You have a couple different examples of that. You have tongue and groove, you have shiplap, nickel gap, as well as just your basic pine trim boards. And Hancock Lumber has a few facilities in the state, Pittsfield, Casco, and Bethel, as well as Irvin right there in Dixfield that uses pine logs and turns them into those pine interior boards. Boltwood. So these are generally hardwood logs, more times than not white birch, that is processed into what is called bolts. And this is more of a historic legacy product in the state of Maine. Bolts are 4-foot sections of wood. So typically a boltwood mill, or historically, they would buy wood in 4-foot increments. So you could have an 8-foot log or a 12-foot log or a 16-foot log. And what they would do is they would buy that log into their mill and then cut it down into 4-foot sections to run it through their mill, run it through their saws, and ultimately process it for the end user that way. More often than not, boltwood has a smaller top diameter minimum than a grade saw log, which is nice because you're able to utilize more of that tree if you have boltwood. You could cut a grade saw log or 2 grade saw logs out from near the bottom of the tree, and as you work your way up that tree and it begins to taper, you might have a piece of wood that still is a pretty high quality piece of wood, but it just doesn't have the top diameter that meets a grade saw log specification. But that's where the boltwood market comes in, and you can utilize that piece of wood to go into that market. And like I said, this is typically white birch, but some other hardwood species occasionally, depending on the market. You know, there is such a thing as hard maple boltwood, yellow birch boltwood. Some I've seen red oak boltwood. It's not very common. Sometimes it might depend on if a sawmill gets a certain order, they're running a certain trial. So again, that's where I'll say it 10 more times during this presentation, but communication with your forester is so key, making sure they understand the markets. And some of the products that might come from boltwood, golf tees. Pride Manufacturing, right in Burnham, Maine, makes a pile of golf tees. If anybody's an avid golfer at the pro shop, you've probably seen their products. If you're teeing off from a Pride golf tee, you should feel proud knowing that came from Burnham, Maine. In Burnham, they also make Lincoln logs, which is pretty neat. I have 2 small children, so I like the fact that when I buy them Lincoln logs, I know that it came from right there in Burnham as well. Wooden handles also. If you buy a chainsaw or something like that and you go buy a file, you know, a small wooden handle, tool handle, all of that, that's generally considered boltwood. Also toothpicks, popsicle sticks, consumable small wooden products. All of these things are generally bought into a mill as boltwood. And a really neat one are pepper and salt mills. That picture right there is from Fletcher's Mills, which is a small sawmill right in New Vineyard, Maine. They make really nice stuff. Can't recommend them enough. Lucky enough, I have a couple of their pieces, and they are very, very nice. If you or someone you know is a cooking fan, definitely a good stocking stuffer, a good gift around the holidays. Also, they make rolling pins. Now we'll talk about mat logs and pallet logs. This is your lowest quality saw log. The reason I say that is they typically allow quite a few surface defects. Generally speaking, again, make sure you understand which market you'd be sending your wood to, but in generality here, a lot of pallet mills and saw and mat mills, they require 0 clear faces. So you could have, for instance, a bump or a seam on every face of that log. That's okay. But the key is it needs to be solid wood because it's a structural issue. They need to make sure they don't necessarily care about aesthetics. It needs to be a solid piece of wood to be able to hold up that pallet, to be able to be put into a crane mat so they can run equipment over it. So really, that's the case when it comes to mat and pallet logs. And pretty self-explanatory here. Hardwood pallets. We have Pallet One right in Livermore Falls, Maine. Pretty incredible facility. They make pallets that go all the way around the world. Really neat facility. Takes a lot of logistics on their part. They are typically sawing wood that's made into pallets that night and then on the truck the next morning. So really impressive just-in-time delivery system they have in their facility. And then your mat logs are typically put into a skidder or a swamp mat. So if you drive by a power line where they're doing maintenance or they're trimming trees back and you see these giant swamp mats, that all came from a mat mill. Mats can be either hardwood, typically they're hardwood, but also hemlock. The hemlock mats have started to gain popularity, and it's nice to have an outlet for some of the hemlock that's being cut in the state for those. And that picture right there is of Glidden Lumber. They're up in Parkman, Maine, but we have a few mat mills across the state that all make, generally speaking, a pretty comparable product. So moving off of saw logs, we'll now talk about pulpwood. So this is a lower quality stem than your saw log, generally because this is going to be chipped up and then go through some sort of pulping digester process to be made into wood pulp for the paper making process. So this can either be hardwood or softwood, depending on what the mill is accepting at the time. And this is one of those products where it might go in as hardwood pulp or softwood pulp, more generally speaking, or it might be softwood pulp, but it needs to be spruce fir, or softwood pulp, but it needs to be pine. So that's where having the forester involved, with them understanding the markets, they can help you out there. Like I mentioned, this is your lower quality than a saw log. And this comes in as a tree length form. There are top diameter restrictions, but they are pretty small, 3-inch, 4-inch. It's not really something where you need a 10-inch top, obviously. It's going in as the whole tree or most of the length of the tree. And when you're driving around in Maine, whenever you see a load of wood going by that looks like a load of firewood or something like that, that's generally a load of pulpwood that's going into a mill. So some of the products that come from pulpwood, you have craft pulp and dissolving pulp. In Maine, pulpwood typically is used in the paper making process. Some other regions might have some other uses for it, but for here, whenever you hear pulpwood, that is typically something that's going to be made into paper at one of the facilities in the state. So I'll talk about what we make at Sappi really quickly here in terms of the pulpwood that we buy. We have 4 production facilities. We have one in Skowhegan, one in Westbrook. Sappi North America, not Sappi, Maine. Skowhegan, Westbrook, Cloquet, Minnesota, and Matane, Quebec. And we make 3 types of paper, generally speaking. We make packaging paper. So this is stuff that your Wendy's fry boxes or paper plate that you use when you go to the gas station to get a slice of pizza, that type of thing, as well as small boxes as well. We also make graphic paper. So this would be your catalog paper if you get a Cabela's or an Amazon catalog around the holiday season, that high quality finished paper with the sheen on it with some sort of coating. That's another example of what we make under the Sappi North America umbrella. We also make something called release paper. This is paper that we make right in Westbrook. And what the release paper is it's a paper with some sort of pattern or molding on it. And what happens is we sell it to a facility that puts some sort of textile on it. And once the textile is set, they peel that release paper back and they imprint that texture onto the final product. So an example of that would be in your car, your dashboard has that leather type texture, or a faux leather football, a faux leather handbag, those types of things. Those are products that are made with release paper there. I'll also mention dissolving pulp. We don't make this in Maine. We make the dissolving pulp at our Cloquet, Minnesota facility, but it's a pretty interesting product. It goes by a couple names, viscose and rayon, and this is actually a product that, that competes with cotton on the textile markets and polyester as well. It's actually spun and then made into fabric that is used in clothing. And finally, we'll talk about our third and final product category, fuel wood. So this is really stuff that's used for being turned into energy. So this is your lowest value product. It's the easiest specification or spec to make. Typically can be either hardwood or softwood, because again, this is product that's going to be chipped up and burnt to make power and steam. And this also can include branches, tops, other harvest residue. If you have a timber harvest done, if you have a whole tree system, which typically does have a chipper with it, this is where they'll actually bring the whole tree right out to the landing, process it on the landing. The tops and the branches that aren't needed in the woods for to minimize soil disturbance will go through the chipper into a chip van and then deliver to a facility that burns biomass for the creation of energy and steam. So some of the products that come from fuel wood, like I mentioned, green chip biomass, that's a pile of biomass we have on site at Somerset. We buy in biomass that we burn for power needs and steam needs. There's also a couple facilities that Re-Energy has in Stratton and Livermore. And we're starting to see a lot of smaller companies, organizations, universities, colleges even burn biomass. Colby College, right in Waterville, Maine, has a pretty large biomass program that they utilize to create energy that counts as green energy for them. Another one is firewood, technically a fuel wood. Everybody knows what firewood is. You buy it, you burn it, you heat your house. So firewood counts as a fuel wood product. And also wood pellets. A lot of people have swapped from burning just straight firewood into putting in a small pellet furnace in their home. When you sell fuel wood that goes into pellets, typically it's brought to the facility. They process it and then scrunch it down into those small wood pellets that everyone's familiar with. We do have a couple wood pellet companies in the state of Maine. We have Wood Pellets Company in Athens, that's their name. And we also have Lignetics, which is right in Strong, Maine, producing that material right here in the state of Maine. So again, that's really a quick hierarchy of products talking about the three general classes as well as some examples of each one there. So now we'll talk about the anatomy of a tree and product classes, that sort of thing. So in this picture here, we have this large yellow birch tree, and we'll kind of break it up piece by piece and talk about which products it might go into. So this first section, that's referred to as the butt log or the first cut on the log. That's typically where, if you're going to have veneer, that's where it's going to live. Now, this tree, we only see one side of it, so we're going to play the hypothetical game that obviously it's not zoomed in, so we can't tell completely, but we're going to assume that's a 4 clear face log. It's got a nice 14-inch top diameter. It meets that veneer spec. There's no seams, there's no rot, there's no nothing. It's just a beautiful straight piece of wood that a veneer mill would love to have. So if we look at that piece of wood, that accounts for about 10% of that tree. And you'll see where I'm going with this a little bit later on, but just 10% for that piece of veneer in terms of the physical space in the amount of that tree that's in the veneer product class. As we work our way up the tree, you see we got still straight clear wood, but we're starting to get a little bit smaller with our top diameter. That tree is naturally tapering. As you work your way up the tree, it's going to get smaller. So now that next cut, we don't have quite the top diameter to meet a veneer specification, and maybe we have a small bump where we've got 3 clear faces instead of 4 clear faces. But not a piece of veneer, but we can make a grade saw log. So now we've got a nice grade saw log that's going to go to Kennebec lumber, hypothetically, that they'll turn into nice hardwood flooring. So we have another 10% of that tree that's going into that grade saw log. After that, we've got a big branch there. We start to get a bunch of defect. Now we're into the pulpwood. Now we're into that material that is going to be brought to a paper mill like us at Sappi. That wood's going to go in. We're going to chip it, run it through our digester, and turn it into a paper plate for the next time you run into the gas station, you forgot lunch, and you got to grab a piece of pizza on the go. And that equates to about 75% of that tree. When you do the math and you look at even some of those limbs that you see, those larger limbs coming off, a good operator can shear those limbs off, and more likely than not, those larger limbs will meet the specification for a piece of pulpwood, we'll take that so you can utilize a lot of that tree that way. So 75%, 3/4 of that tree is in pulpwood. And finally, your tops, your branches, say the logging contractor has a chipper, the rest of that tree, we can run through the chipper and use it as fuel wood. So the last 5% of that tree, in terms of total volume, we're going to chip to be turned into energy at some facility, whether it's us at Sappi or some other biomass user out there on the market. So that's your breakdown of total volume of that tree. But, and again, I looked at some general numbers. I will do a disclaimer. This is just speaking on generalities, but in terms of percent value of that tree, when we start to go down the list, that piece of veneer is over a third of the value of that tree, even though it makes up only 1/10 of the total volume. The grade saw log is about 14% of that tree. The pulpwood is about half the value of that single tree. And the fuel wood is only 2% of the value of that tree. So really you see how important it is to understand the markets, understand the timber you have on your woodlot, and make sure you're communicating with your forester and that they're communicating with the logging contractor to make sure you're utilizing every piece of every tree to its highest possible market value. It is not just a clean one-to-one where the veneer is 10% of the tree volume, so now it's 10% of the value in that tree. On the contrary, it's weighed heavily in terms of value in that proposition for a veneer. So you can see quickly how you will not get the most bang for your buck for your timber harvest all of a sudden if they're taking a piece of veneer and sending it to a pulp mill, or taking a piece of veneer and sending it to a biomass facility. And it really gets down to understanding every little minute detail, because even if you're taking a grade saw log and you're sending that to a pallet mill in a time where you can get more money for that grade saw log than that piece of pallet, those small things add up over time. And depending how big your woodlot is, what you're cutting, how much you're cutting, all of that compounds. So you want to make sure that you have a clear understanding, a good idea of what you have out there, make sure your forester understands, make sure you're clear on the markets, all of that. So as we wind down today, I do have a couple takeaways. We've been talking about a lot of these themes, but I wanted to bring them all in on one slide and kind of have one more shot to give some advice as everybody goes off of this webinar here. So the first takeaway, assess your standing timber. And what I mean by that is you're typically doing it anyways. You have this woodlot, you enjoy going for walks, whether it's just as simple as on a lazy Sunday morning, you decide to go for a walk out back, or if you're an avid birder, if you hunt, if you ride your bike, any of that. Try to get a good idea of what's out there for standing timber. Look at the wood. How much hardwood do you have? How much softwood do you have? Oh, I have a small grove of pine trees over here. How big are those pine trees? Are there limbs going all the way to the ground where they might not be as high quality? Or are they just these big, massive pines that are gun barrel straight and there's not a limb for 60 feet? Getting a feel for what's there on the ground and trying to look at it fairly unbiased. Everybody loves their own woodlot. Everybody thinks their woodlot is the best. That comes with part of it, of being somebody who owns a woodlot and loves it. That's all part of it. But trying to understand and have a realistic idea of what's out there is key, because that'll help set up your decisions and the conversations you have as your timber harvest approaches and you're ready to cut. Discuss your market options. It isn't as simple as, oh, I know this market in, say you have a woodlot in Portland, Maine, or on the outskirts of Portland. Oh, I know a market that's in Aroostook County, up by the Canadian border. Well, that's good, but once you take the trucking out of it, in terms of paying somebody to truck that wood all the way up there, it might not be your best option. So understanding your local options, understand whether it's at the town level, the county level, the state level, or even going outside of the state as well, or even out of the country, depending on the Canadian market. Understanding what markets are around you, how your wood best works in those markets is so key. Again, very, very important to have some sort of idea and have those conversations with your forester. And if you don't know, simply ask. Not only a market takeaway, but just in general, typically when you're going to cut wood, you should have some sort of contract, right? You should have some sort of idea. What is the prescription? What is the scope of work? How does this all work? More times than not, the marketing, how you will be paid, what rate you will be paid for different products will be on that contract. Make sure you understand that. Make sure you review it. If you have questions, ask. Any good forester will want you to ask questions. They want to make sure that you're comfortable with this whole process. So it's really key that you understand exactly what you're signing your name to, exactly what you are going to have done to your woodlot. Another thing, if you are doing a harvest, take a look at what's on the landing. And what I mean by landing is the area where they are bringing the wood to before it's on the truck and going to its final stop, whether it's a sawmill, a log yard, a pulp mill, a biomass facility, anything like that. I showed that picture earlier on where I said this pile of wood doesn't equal this pile of wood. Both of those pictures were taken on the landing. So it's a really good practice to just get out there, take a look at the piles of wood. Does something stick out? You don't even need to know necessarily the difference between a soft maple versus a hard maple. If you're looking at a pile of wood and you see one stick that just sticks out and it doesn't look like the other pieces of wood in there, ask your forester, hey, I noticed this. Why is that piece of wood in there? You know, it's their job to make sure that they are utilizing your wood to its highest market value. So those are questions that you're more than valid in asking. Obviously, I will say make sure safety is being accounted for. Don't recommend going out there when they're actively working on the job. Wear PPE, hard hat, safety glasses, safety vest. Make sure they can see you if you're out there during active operations. But again, just that's a really good practice. Just as simple as taking a look at the piles of wood, looking it over, understanding your contract at that point where, okay, this pile of wood is spruce fir logs and it's going to mill X. This pile of wood is hardwood logs. This is going to mill X. It's just really key to understand and be able to be involved and understanding what's happening. Because when a timber harvest starts with today's high level, high efficiency equipment, it typically goes pretty quickly. So making sure that if you see something, you say something, so then a change could be made if there is an issue. And finally, I've been saying it all along, communication with your forester, whether it's on markets, whether it's on your objectives, your prescription, anything like that. It's really important to make sure you have an open line of communication with your forester, that they're aware of any sort of concern you might have. Hopefully they're keeping you involved in the process. They're updating you as to what's going on out there. But specifically on the markets, if you have any questions, you should reach out to your forester and just ask. Like I just mentioned before about the landing inspections. If you're out there one afternoon after the crew leaves, the forester, maybe he stopped in on a Monday and today's Thursday. If you see something out of place, it's as simple as a quick phone call, a quick text, a quick email. Hey, I'm out here right now. This quite doesn't look right. What do we think here? Should this stick of wood be over here? Does this pile of wood, does this make sense? Just an open line of communication. Make sure that they're on it. You're going to show that you're on it. It's just really good all the way around to make sure that you are getting exactly what you want. Because again, it's a massive decision to harvest your woodlot. Whether it's a property that you purchased or you inherited, you know, it's a very, very important thing that when you do that harvest, hopefully everything goes exactly the way that you want. And anything you can do to turn the odds in your favor to make sure that those things are happening is so important. So with that, again, I'll just say thank you very much for letting me present today. I know that was a lot of information pretty quickly. If there are any questions, Casey, I think obviously we've got time. We can take them.